Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks to Stephen Jacobs, Professor Jacobs, thanks to the sponsors, thanks to the Provost, and thanks to RIT for hosting this very interesting and important event. My name's Tom Arison. I am the Director of the Board on Research Data and Information at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine in Washington. And I think what we decided to do for this panel is that I guess I can do it in order here. We can, each of the panelists will give kind of 5 minutes or so of introductory remarks about their perspectives on the topic and their experience and involvement with the topic. And then I'll probably give a little bit after the 4 panelists about my involvement, and then we'll go to a few questions. I'll put out a few questions that we've kind of discussed and mulled over in advance, and go through some discussion, and then take some questions, topics from the audience too. So first get that up. So I guess the first speaker will be Kathleen Fitzpatrick, who is Director of Digital Humanities at Michigan State University.
Awesome, thank you. Is this?
Want to get up? Or?
Oh, I can get up. Why not? I have slides, but will not show them to you. I'll just use them for my own personal reference. Yeah, no problem, no problem. Happy to stand. Always makes me feel like I'm actually speaking a little bit better anyhow. So I am, as you've heard, Director of Digital Humanities at Michigan State University. I'm also in that role, I direct a small research and development unit called MESH, which is working on the future of open digital scholarly communication. And one of the primary projects that we support through MESH is Humanities Commons, which you can take a peek at hcommons.org. It's a platform that was originally built by the Modern Language Association with support from the Mellon Foundation and from the National Endowment for the Humanities, that was designed to support member-to-member communication among folks who belong to the MLA. And it was later then opened to anyone who wanted to create an account. So today, we have more than 30,000 scholars and practitioners across the humanities and around the world who are there sharing their work with one another, participating in discussion groups, building web projects, and more. And we've also just recently received a significant grant from the National Science Foundation that's going to enable us to work on opening the first node on this network that's really aimed at STEM fields, that's working with folks in discipline-based education research, to bring the folks from all of their many fields together into a research coordination network that's based on fair and care open science principles. And so we're going to be opening the network to a lot more fields and probably renaming it as a result. As the commercial used to say, however, I'm not just the president, I'm also a customer. I am currently conducting an open review of my current book project on Humanities Commons. It's at leadinggenerously.hcommons.org if you want to take a peek at what this project is doing. I could go on about, community review and the commons and infrastructure and values and goals for quite some time, but like what I wanted to say in these few minutes is something that's a little bit more personal and a little bit more institutional, right? Why did I turn to open review for these book projects, and how has my institution supported that work? So what I can tell you about the why I did this, I started blogging in 2002, and it became really evident to me really fast. I was an assistant professor at the time, that my work was getting into much greater circulation and much more rapid circulation through that blog than it was through conventional scholarly communication channels. But even more importantly, I was building for that work not just a readership, but a community. And that community really mattered to me. So when my second book, post tenure, was coming up for review, I asked my editor at the press who was going to be publishing it if he would object to my doing an open community review process, because it was that community that I had built that I really wanted feedback from on this project. And that decision, was hugely helped by the fact that I had tenure at that point, right? So my institution was very unlikely to fire me because of this. But at the same time, I also knew that I was coming up for full professor soon, and I wanted my institution to grapple with what that open review meant in the context of institutional promotion processes and so forth. That kind of worked and kind of didn't. I ended up getting promoted, but not without a really ugly fight. And I ended up not in a totally related way, but not in a totally unrelated way either, leaving the institution that I was at and going to work for the Modern Language Association in order to work on these kinds of policies across the fields that the MLA represents, and to think about how we could foster greater, more open communication among scholars in the humanities. We built MLA Commons, which turned into Humanities Commons. And then I hit a point at which it was time for me to take what I had done back out into the academy. So I moved to Michigan State University, where I am right now, in part to go work for the dean to whom I report. I'm extremely lucky in this relationship. Chris Long, who is the dean of the College of Arts and Letters at MSU, has been working very actively for the last 8 years on trying to transform tenure and promotion processes in the academy to recognize and support open work in a whole lot of different ways. And I'm happy to dig into some of the particulars about it as we get into the Q&A portion. But I kind of want to end by pointing to something that happened not at any place that I've gotten to work, right? But at I think a really key moment in the potential transformation of the relationship between an institution and open work, which is that 15 years ago, in 2007, Bernard Rentier, who was then the rector at the University of Liège, figured out that the key component of a university open access mandate is not the policy that says you, faculty, must deposit your stuff in our institutional repository, but instead the policy that says your annual review, faculty, will only be based on the things that you have deposited in the open repository. Right. And so that process of making the repository the source of truth for an annual review produced a 95% compliance across Liège immediately with that open work policy. So at any rate, thinking about how we can use policies, not just to support those who are doing open work, but to really foster a culture of openness is, I think, a big part of what I'm hoping we can think about today. I just realized I didn't actually do this.
Oh, good, because I don't have enough hands for. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Berg. I'm the Director of Libraries at MIT. I'm also the founding director of something called the Center for Research on Equitable and Open Scholarship, also at MIT. I'm delighted to be here, and thanks, Stephen, for the invite, and thanks everyone who set this up. So I'm just going to give a few remarks about the context at MIT, and primarily framed around what the MIT Libraries is doing to support and advance open scholarship. And I hope I'll do it in a way that kind of provides an example for how university libraries can be really major players in advancing open work in many, many different ways. Because I think I might be one of the few reps from a university library here. Raise your hand, my tribe. Okay, that's cool. I'm often the only one of my kind in a room. That's okay. I'm okay with that. All right, so first, for those who don't know, the MIT context, MIT has a long history of supporting open everything, right? Several decades ago, sort of the radical idea with open OpenCourseWare, that we would share our course syllabus and course content with the world so that everyone could access parts of an MIT education freely and openly on the web. Pretty big deal. You all probably know better than I do MIT and MIT luminaries' role in advancing early open source work. Already been mentioned faculty open access policies. So in 2009, MIT passed one of the first all campus open access policies in the US. And that's a policy that says that by virtue of being on the faculty at MIT, you grant to MIT the worldwide, non-exclusive, forever time right to openly share, license to openly share your journal articles in a repository to the world freely. And in fact, you have an obligation to do so. As Kathleen talks, the obligation is sometimes honored in the breach, shall we say, but I'll get to that. So we've got this faculty OA policy. We were one of the first. And then I came to MIT in 2015. And not long afterwards, we launched an open access task force. We launched it in 2019, 10 years after passing the open access policy, which part of that policy was it'll be reviewed every 5 years. So we were a little late, but we finally got around to launching a task force to review what we were doing and kind of examine what else can we do to advance open at MIT, which, you know, we might adopt that that phrasing, although I don't want to get confused with open at RIT. So so the task force looked at everything, right, and made a whole bunch of recommendations. If you Google MIT Open Access Task Force, I won't bore you with all of the recommendations. But one of the recommendations was that there were a couple of key recommendations. One was that each department should figure out its own path to open, right? So there was this recognition that there are vast disciplinary differences in the kinds of research output that's produced in a literature department versus a mechanical engineering department, and therefore different routes to opening it up, whether it's data or journal articles or monographs or code or research protocols. There's also across disciplines, people are sort of at disciplines are at different points in grappling with what it means to open up their research product. So one of the recommendations was that it would be a department by department project to just keep people moving along a trajectory towards more open. That was one of the really important recommendations that we're still trying to get off the ground, to be frank. And then another one was that we develop a set of principles for how MIT, through the libraries, would negotiate with publishers for both read access, so access to get to literature that is otherwise behind a paywall, but also for the rights of MIT authors to publish with these publishers. And that became the MIT framework, which sort of colloquially says, we're not really interested anymore in paying rent for the content that our own faculty produce. Instead, we want a contract that says authors get to retain their rights and the control over the research that they've done, and we will pay to publishers for value-added services that they put on top of that content. We've signed, I think we're up to 10 contracts with various publishers that we consider aligned with our framework. And we have been out of contract with one major publisher for over 2 years now because they have not been interested in offering us a contract that aligns with our framework. We can talk about that as well. A couple of other things that we've been doing, and these are all coming out of the library. And again, this is the libraries are, that point of negotiation with publishers is one of the only places where a university actually has a moment of leverage around journal articles especially, and increasingly around what happens with the data as well. So I just want to make sure that I'm putting in your head the idea that the library really can and should play a major role in advancing open on a campus. Just quickly, a couple of other things that we're doing. I mentioned that I'm the founding director of something called the Center for Research on Equitable and Open Scholarship. I mean, the story there is essentially, as I talked about open scholarship across this MIT and other campuses I've been on and in conferences, honestly, I got frustrated with otherwise brilliant scholars who would resort to anecdotes and assumptions when they talked about how we would advance open. You know, they'd be like, oh, well, the way you incentivize people to do X is Y. And it's like, what's your research on that? So put my money where my mouth was, and we launched a Center for Research in Equitable and Open Scholarship within the libraries. I got some funding from the Mellon Foundation, and we right now, and also from IMLS, to run a bunch of research projects that really kind of dig into what actually does work as an incentive to get people to engage in open sharing of their research products. We're also interested in how open connects and doesn't connect with equity. So we're looking at diversity in editorial boards. One of the really interesting findings is it turns out that on journals that are on open journals, there is less diversity in the editorial boards than on traditional paywall journals. So open and equitable don't always go together. So we need to pay attention to that. There's some other research projects I can talk about there. And then two more recent things that we're doing is we've very, very recently launched significant support for open data. So there are, you know, as on any campus that's super decentralized, there are people doing things around open, around different parts of open and different kinds of research outputs who maybe don't know each other and don't know that they're doing it and are, I don't know, maybe replicating work. So again, the libraries is this great centralizing force that is interdisciplinary and accessible to everyone. So I teamed up with a colleague in the School of Science and took some money that I got from the provost, and we're offering open data prizes at MIT for the first time. And it's designed specifically, we decided that the prizes would be for the next generation. We wanted to sort of incentivize and support and reward sort of what we're calling research trainees. So it's for research scientists, graduate students, postdocs, but not for faculty, who are doing something around open data, whether they're creating data and sharing it openly, whether they're making creative use of data that is openly available, or whether they're theorizing and writing about open data. And we'll be having a huge event during Open Access Week in late October, where we'll award the prizes and give the scholars who won the prizes a chance to present on their work, and also have a networking event for anyone on campus who's working in the area of open data. And then finally, the incentives question is really, really an important one. And I think probably most of you are aware of the recent announcement out of the White House Office of Science Technology policy that drops the embargo on journal articles and asks federal agencies to put into place plans for zero embargo, open access to journal articles based on research they have funded. At MIT, colleagues and I are looking to use that as a way to talk about, okay, this is now required. You're going to have to share your research output. If it's funded, if it's federally funded, you're going to have to share it without an embargo. So it's required. Let's reward it. Let's take this work that you're already doing and let's make sure we write into hiring, tenure, and promotion policies that you will be rewarded and recognized for that. It's actually turning out to be, you know, tenure and promotion has always been thought of as the third rail. You can't touch it, you can't change it. But this is a way of saying you're already doing something, let's just reward you for doing it. So we're finding that that's a really nice in. And I was 90% compliance with a faculty OA policy is amazing. We have 60% compliance at MIT, and every conference I go to, I claim that that's the highest in the US, and nobody said I'm wrong. So I choose to believe, and I like to think we're competitive enough, somebody would have said so. But we're at that rate only because we are not relying on self-submissions from authors. I've resourced staff in the libraries to go out and get the articles and put them in. And that's how you do it. You don't ask authors to do their own work. So, okay.
Good morning. I'm Randy Hall from University of Southern California. And I'm going to talk a bit about how I got into the topic of open. And it was a bit of a sidestep from a broader effort. I served as the Vice President of Research for about 15 years at the university. I'm no longer in that role. I'm a faculty member. And I study innovation in universities now as a faculty member. But as VP of Research, about a decade ago, I observed, along with others in the university, that digitization and technology were changing the nature of products of research and also changing the practices of research. And the motivation for initiative that we called Creativity and Collaboration in the Academy was, how do we adapt our styles of research, our methods of communication to what technology had to offer? And just to contrast that to maybe a decade or two prior, when we produced research, it was largely in the form of a paper journal article or perhaps a paper book. And the paper form is not very fast for distribution. It's not very accessible. It doesn't lend to sharing data or sharing other types of research products. But as we become to digitize, then that product can be shared instantaneously, and it can be accessible instantaneously, and it can occur in many different forms. And so within this initiative on creativity and collaboration, we were examining really two things. One is, what is the changing nature of the product itself? What does it look like? So a traditional article having a structure of tables and figures and text and so on is restrictive compared to what you can do with media. And then secondly, what is the changing nature of collaboration? And so traditional journal articles, they'd be published and others would be able to read that, and that would influence future research. And that is a form of collaboration, but it's a very slow form of collaboration. When we digitize, it can be more simultaneous, that different teams working in different places can share products as the work progresses. And so there's an opportunity there. So from that fundamental principle then came, well, what do we do about openness? And so it changes from this slow process where maybe you're holding on to your results until that paper article appears to something that enables sharing immediately. So from that, a variety of things spun off from that. One were some very meaningful policy changes. And in fact, we did change our tenure and promotion policy about a decade ago to explicitly recognize digitized products as a new type of output that is recognized in tenure and promotion. We changed in terms of recognizing collaboration and different types of interdisciplinarity into our policy as well. And then we created other types of policies. We created a policy on attribution, which was very important as new kinds of products appeared. How do you know who does what and contributes when you could think of it as sort of as an analogy, mashups that occur in music, and then people sample music and put into new music products. And how do we recognize that somebody contributed to another product that came from that? And so attribution was created, and then some policy on biorepositories. So sharing specimens and sharing data from a biomedical standpoint was another aspect. So that was one way I got into the world of open. And then another part was I served for a while as chair of the board for an organization called the University Industry Demonstration Partnership. And UIDP is a longstanding organization whose purpose is to enable collaborations between companies and universities and research. And within that, there was a group of companies that wanted to sponsor research where public dedication of the intellectual property was actually mandated in the agreement. Now, that's not necessarily typical, but for some companies, they wanted neither the company nor the university to patent protect the products or to even copyright protect the products in a conventional sense. And then the question was, how do we even make that work in the university? And frankly, there are a lot of complexities of making that work. It's not as obvious as it might seem that, of course, faculty would want to do it or the university wants to do it because there are unintended aspects, particularly if you have some research that has a public dedication requirement and other research which is federally sponsored, in which the university protects it, and there's obligations to the inventors to share the income from those inventions. You sort of have conflicting rights that occur in that. In any case, we develop policies on that too. From these experiences and from research I do on how universities innovate in their practices, just a couple of remarks. One is universities struggle with alignment of policies with each other and alignment of policies with their underlying mission and purpose. And one thing you'll find is in virtually all research universities, they emphasize three missions, and one is knowledge production, the other is knowledge dissemination, and the third is public service. Those are the three things they're trying to do. Of course, it doesn't say anything in there about we want to protect intellectual property. In fact, it does say things that might promote openness and sharing. But at the same time, every university also has an intellectual property policy, and that intellectual property policy does talk about protection of intellectual property and patenting and commercialization. Most universities today also have policies surrounding information security, and those in charge of information security may be very motivated to limit access to the data that the university owns. And that data that the university produces from research is something that they actually own. And those kind of intention to protect and protect what are considered critical assets can get in the way of openness. And then we've already talked about tenure and promotion policies. And tenure and promotion policies in many ways align very well with openness because in the end, they do recognize knowledge sharing as an important aspect of it, but they very rarely use the word openness in like open scholarship. We've looked at policies around the world, and explicit recognition of openness is extremely rare. And where I found it most often is in the UK and not in the United States. It's more common to recognize entrepreneurship and sort of the commercialization aspect than it is openness in policies. And so the other thing to recognize is that the policies within the universities are created by different groups at different points of time. And so the people writing the mission statement and the people writing the strategic plan and the intellectual property policy, tenure promotion policy, they're different people working on those different elements, and they have different provenances to them. So I'll say at USC, our intellectual property policy was written about 2 decades ago, and we kind of don't dare touch it because it opens this can of worms as soon as you look at it of competing interests. Tenure and promotion is kind of updated every year to a small extent. Strategic plans typically are rewritten when you have a new president, and then they sit there, frankly. Missions may be a lot older than that, and sometimes they were written decades ago or centuries ago. Sometimes they're very old. And then the last thing I'll say, there is this tension that exists in universities between privacy and proprietary inclinations and transparent inclinations. And there are very good reasons for this. Now, we possess data that in essence is private, and it can be private at an individual level. We maintain health records for individuals. For instance, we have student data. We have all kinds of data that you may need to protect for pure privacy interests. You have data that you may protect for sponsor interests, where the sponsor insists on us protecting that data set. You may have sponsorship from the federal government, which has information security requirements. So you have a lot of things that we are obligated to keep private. At the same time, we as an institution have the mission of really openness and transparency. So universities really struggle with this. And I feel like where universities ought to make meaningful progress is development policies that actually merge the notions of privacy and transparency together. And I really haven't seen that. So there are privacy policies, and those tend to be driven by regulations and sponsor obligations and so forth. And then there's some transparent, maybe sharing policies, but they never really blend that well together. And I do see a real opportunity for that for the future. So those are some of my thoughts, and I'll turn it over to the next speaker.
I'm going to stay where I am, if that's all right. Hello, everyone. My name's Richard Holliman. You may guess from the accent that I'm not American. I'm based in the United Kingdom, and I work for an Open University. Work for the Open University, sorry, which is a national university in the UK, dealing with the 4 component nations: Wales, Ireland, Scotland, and England. Yes. Yeah, I had to remember that. That's where I live. So just to say, like Kathleen, I did a few slides. I've tweeted them if you want to look at any of the reports I'm going to talk about today. So if you look for Ava's Twitter handle or the Magic RIT Twitter handle, you'll find them on there. You can find me at science_engage. So yeah, everything I'm going to talk about today is open access, so you can have a look at it, what we tried to do. But what I'm going to talk about is a little bit about a specific element of organizational and cultural change. And I think all 4 of us here are talking really about organizational and cultural change and how do we make ourselves more open. You won't be too surprised. I think it's been hinted at a little bit by the other 3 speakers that universities can be quite conservative in changing. And one of the things I tried to do about 10 years ago is lead a program of organization and cultural change to make ourselves more open. And the project was called an Open Research University. So as the Open University, we were already very open in the way we teach, but less so in the ways we did research. And in doing that, we used a tool called the EDGE tool, which again, you'll find in the slides, but the EDGE stands for embryonic, developing, embedding, and gripping. And what that did was allude to the fact that we're all dealing with moving target here. Yeah. So we're dealing with a moving target across academic cultures in different universities, and we're often dealing with a moving target within universities. Different academic disciplines buy into this concept of openness in slightly different ways. And what that tool allowed us to do was to go into each of the faculties and each of the big research cultures and use evidence. Loving that from Chris. Evidence is a big driver for change here, to get them to self-assess where they felt they were in the context of openness. And through that work, we were allowed to do, we were enabled 2 things we did. One of which was to define the area. And our first speaker this morning talked a little bit about definition of open work. We did some of that work at the Open University and came up with a definition of what we called engaged research, open engaged research. So it was less focused on the products of research and more on the processes by which open work can be used. So that's what we did in terms of that. That gave us a kind of agreed definition for how we would then work on our recognition and reward. Yeah. So that kind of closed box of what you call tenure. We don't have tenure in the UK. Do you know what I mean? We say that promotion. Yeah. How do you change your promotion profiles to recognize and reward excellence in this kind of work? And that's basically what I'm going to talk about today. So in terms of that kind of agreed definition, that's obviously a really first starting point. We've talked a little bit about the need for leadership in this kind of area. We were lucky to have a equivalent of a vice principal. We call them pro-vice chancellors in the UK, who supported this work and allowed us to go through our promotion criteria. And so if you introduced a new profile, so we have profiles for teaching, we have profiles for research, we have profiles for teaching research. If you introduced a new profile, which we ended up calling knowledge exchange, what would it look like? What does excellence look like in knowledge exchange? And that was introduced in 2015. And since then, we've promoted 9 professors at the Open University under the knowledge exchange profile. And what that does is obviously give you a wide range of excellence, academic excellence across the institution. And just to give you an idea of where they work in educational technology, they work in business and management, psychology, health and social care, sociology, computing, and environmental science. So we've touched pretty much every part of the organization in introducing these profiles. So one just tiny last thought to put in context where we are and where we think we're going. Do you know what I mean? As I say, it's a moving target. We're all kind of addressing this from slightly different perspectives and slightly different levels of embeddedness, if you like. The university then went through a process of revision, you know, a refresh and a revision a couple of years ago. We didn't actually change the knowledge exchange profile. What we did is work on the barriers. Yeah. What are the barriers that sit behind the system, often back channels, yeah? Senior academics telling younger academics, this is what you should do, and this is what will get you your next job, to basically remove these myths, basically. So a lot of my work now at the institution, apart from what I do in terms of the kind of standard day job, is in supporting academics, supporting applicants, supporting assessors of promotion cases, and crucially supporting line management. How do we support academics to do this broader range of work in open and engaged research? And that's my lot.
Well, thanks, everyone, for those variety of great perspectives on this topic of open work in academia. I'm just going to do a quick thing about me, and then we'll get to some questions for the panelists. I am, as I said, Thomas Arison. I'm Director of the Board on Research, Data, and Information at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine in Washington, D.C. The academies are private nonprofit honorific bodies that also have a congressional charter to advise the nation on science, technology, medicine, engineering related policy issues. And so the Board on Research, Data, and Information, BIRDI, I've been working with them for maybe 4 or 5 years. And so our involvement in this topic encompasses several different projects, and we're working on other ones. And just kind of to introduce the academies broadly, we do several kinds of work. We do expert committee consensus studies that have findings and recommendations. We do convening either through roundtables, forums, or workshops. And we also have some operational programs. We do some grant management of grant programs, particularly international, those promoting international collaboration, and also fellowship programs that we run for different federal and private sponsors. So BIRDI is a standing board, standing committee that oversees a portfolio of activities. And in recent years, more of our activity is focused on open and promoting open and fostering open. And just a couple examples. This report, 2018, Open Science by Design. This committee was chaired by Alexa McRae at Harvard and supported by Arnold Ventures, and it kind of lays out some requirements and recommendations, findings on how to better foster open, how the different stakeholders in the U.S. research enterprise, funders, academics, societies, and others might take action to foster open. We've also, for the last 3 years, we've sponsored the Roundtable on Aligning Incentives for Open Scholarship, which is roundtables are facilitated stakeholder conversations, which are kind of supported by the participants. And Randy and Chris have been heavily involved as members of that roundtable. And I see Brianna Fardy and the audience has also been involved. And that is, we're starting our second 3-year cycle of activity. The first cycle produced, among other things, a workshop report with authored papers, developing a toolkit for fostering open science practices, which was published as under a CC BY license and is available. All these are available for at no charge, PDF form online. All Academy reports are. And so that has gotten a fair amount of pickup and traction. And the roundtable has also resulted in several spin-off activities. Most prominent one that's kind of farthest along is the Higher Education Leadership Initiative for Open Scholarship, or HELIOS, which again, Chris and Randy are both heavily involved in. And that is, not an Academy activity, but we will be interacting with HELIOS and they'll be reporting back to the roundtable at our meetings. And we'll be, figuring out other things, useful things to do together. A third study, which came out recently, automated research workflows for accelerated discovery. And this is a consensus study chaired by Dan Atkins at Michigan and supported by Schmidt Futures, which I think it kind of lays out how openness and broad access to various resources for research, including computation, data, automated laboratory equipment in some cases, articles, and the use of artificial intelligence tools and techniques have the potential to rapidly expand the scope and speed of research processes. And I think that this report, I think across a number of fields, and it's different in different fields, but I think that this report, does a good job of making the case that, the next phase of IT supported research and scholarship and innovation will be greatly enhanced and accelerated by openness. So that's what we're up to. We're also trying to raise money for a couple new initiative studies, one on the future of scholarly communication, one on how the US should play in the area of open research commons, which those are, the EU, the European Commission has launched one, other countries have launched one, and this is kind of the combination of compute and data and related resources and making those open. So I will start my questions for the panel, and I guess we can just kind of go through as you feel that you want to pass the mic, feel as you want to go through and address. And I think the first one maybe you've addressed to some extent, which is, what are the prerequisites? What were the necessary conditions in your institutions to get started? And, and to some extent, what to keep going, such as kind of top leadership support or other things, an external funder, those sorts of things. And so I'll just kind of pass that, so first, and institutions looking to start open work, what should they be looking for? What do they need?
So I mean, Part of what I needed in order to get started, and I'm sorry, I know I'm a little bit blocked by the podium here. Part of what I needed was just a sort of a naivete about what it was going to mean for me to start writing in public and doing the work that I was doing in the open. But beyond that, at a certain point, I needed the confidence that my institution was not going to punish that openness, right? And that took a long time and a couple of changes of institution for that to come about. So I mentioned that my current dean, Chris Long, has been working on revised tenure and promotion policies. It's also revised annual review policies that are really aimed at getting the faculty every year to articulate what the long-term goals for their work are. And recognizing that the long-term goals are not going to be the same, even within a department for faculty members. To then think about how the work they're doing year by year is moving them toward those long-term goals. And that process of articulation, I think, allows the faculty to think radically differently about the work that they're doing, because the review process itself becomes a conversation rather than a hurdle or a gatekeeping moment. And so I think that kind of transformation of processes of evaluation to recognize what it is we need them to do, rather than being the sort of, are you in lockstep with the way I think your career should be conducted, is a huge part of what needs to happen institutionally to support open work.
Yeah, I totally agree with all of that. I also, is this on? Okay, sorry. I also think, in my experience, it's gone through different phases. So I've been able to get a fair amount accomplished when I first got to MIT, kind of by flying under the radar, right? So I spun up a research institute, got some funding, didn't really tried to stay under the radar and did what I could. But at a certain point, you hit a wall when you're flying under a radar, and you have to, if you want to go further, you've got to sort of build your coalition and do things that will be longer term and institutional level. One of the things I'm realizing right now is that my current most active ally is an associate dean in the School of Science, who herself is a brain and cognitive scientist and is very much an advocate for open scholarship from the point of view of reproducibility and rigor. And what we have found is we have different accesses. We have different modes of accessing the power structures at MIT. So I report directly to the provost, and I sit on academic council, and I sit on the dean's council. And so I have access to the formal power networks at MIT, but I'm not faculty. So I can persuade leadership. I have that access. She has the credibility of being a faculty member, a practicing faculty member and associate dean. So she has a different kind of power. So I actually think that one of the things we don't talk about enough in terms of how you get things done in bureaucracies is having a coalition with people who have understandings of and access to different modes of sort of activating the power structures.
I got one here. So I'll answer in two ways. One was, how do we get that initial initiative started on creativity and collaboration? And there are really two elements. One was fundamental grassroots support or interests. And within the university, there are people here and there in different departments, different schools, different disciplines, some in science, some in engineering, but many in the humanities, who are exploring new ways of conducting their research or communicating their research, fundamentally digital, kind of digital in a native form rather than in traditional paper form. And an observation was in humanities in particular, where there was great emphasis on producing the paper book as a final product. There's some question as to how do you evaluate a product that isn't really paper in its essence. And you may recall also in engineering and sciences, if you go back more than a decade ago, there was a lot of tension as to whether a non-paper product, non-paper article would count the same as something that's printed and distributed in paper form. And I'd say the world has largely gotten past that point because people in journal articles kind of rarely today look at paper versions of them. It's become all digital. The second point, and I'll go back to the roundtable. And so serving on the roundtable, one thing we did was create a guide for university presidents and provosts. And it's a 2-page guide, and it addresses questions like who should be involved in open initiatives, what are the fundamental elements of those initiatives, kind of what are the services, what are the infrastructure, what are the policies, what are the rewards. And the reason why we wrote this for provosts and presidents was the realization that to align the various pieces together, it all comes together at the level of the provost or president, and maybe only at the president. And so you look at the IT organization, you look at the libraries, you look at the schools, and you look at the research office, et cetera. None of those pieces has control over all the elements of open. And really, it's only at the president level that they converge. The challenge is that for many presidents, and not really to criticize presidents, they're not necessarily paying attention to this issue. And they have lots of concerns. They're dealing with the day-to-day problems. They're working with trustees. They're working with legislatures and so on. And somehow you have to get their attention. And so this was one of our purposes, and one of the purposes in creating the Helios organization was that to join, to be part of Helios, you needed to have the endorsement of the president. That president needs to sign on and say, I'm going to be involved. Now, maybe a lot of the work is delegated, but it has to come at that leadership level. And I think it really is important to have the leadership level combined with the grassroots level to make it work.
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything the panel members said. I think just to add a slightly different perspective, I guess. I mean, I think it's very easy for everybody in this room to make the argument for open work. Yeah, I think everybody here is because they believe in it. Yeah, so we're the idealists. Yeah, so that's the easy audience to win. Actually, the harder one is obviously the senior leadership, to get them to change things. And to do that, we need those kind of connections. We need those allies. We need the evidence. But certainly in the UK context, the biggest thing that made a difference was that we had to. Yeah, so we have a research audit every 6 or 7 years in the UK, which is currently called the Research Excellence Framework. And they introduced a new element to that, which was around working beyond the institution, working beyond universities, to generate what they called social and economic impact. And that changed the game for everybody. Yeah. So that moved you beyond that kind of short-term change where you've got the good connections and you've got a friendly vice principal or whoever it is, do you know what I mean? And then they move on, you get somebody else and it all falls away. Yeah. That changed everything. The policy level changed everything. And then universities had to respond to that. And the way we did that was to say, okay, this is something we value over the long term. So we'll introduce promotion criteria for the long term and allow people to develop a career over a good number of years from postgrad right the way through to professor.
Thanks very much, everyone. I'm going to, looking at the time, I'm going to combine 2 of the other questions to try to get it something that I think are important. So, so I'm going to combine sort of the barriers, challenges question and with the opportunities question. And so, and you can address either or both. Can you identify one thing or 1 or 2 things, either in the institution or externally, that if it was removed or reduced or lowered would really help facilitate the advance of open work in your institution? So that's, and then the other one is opportunities. Is if you get lowered barrier, if you advance this work to the extent that you advance it, and maybe you can see some of this coming already, what's the vision that you have for what open work can accomplish in your institution and perhaps more broadly? And how do you make other people see that? Is that possible? You know, are you able to do that? Because I think that that's part of what the challenge we face is sort of, you know, getting other people to see this vision. So thanks.
Right, I'm going to start with the barrier because it seems to me the obvious one. Within the academy, the primary barrier to change of most kinds within the academy is a very stubborn and somewhat intractable definition of prestige, right? And where prestige inheres. So the real opportunity, I think, for open work is in creating new and more appealing and more equitable forms of the thing that we think of as prestige, right? What it means to have your work make an impact in the world. And that, I think, is going to be the primary driver within a lot of the academy for thinking about how the new kinds of policies that we're seeing, like the Nelson Memo and so forth, really are able to lift up forms of work that have previously been overlooked because they haven't had the kind of prestige that we're used to. That prestige has come with exclusivity. And if we can begin to redefine prestige as being an embrace of the open and the equitable, we might be able to get some traction on really making change across the academy.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely key. I think one thing that I'll mention that is a barrier, and I don't know if it's the most important one, but it strikes me as one that we haven't figured out yet, is, and it's related to this prestige issue, right? Is that there are pressures on faculty to publish their work. There is in fact work involved in publishing. I also have responsibility for the MIT Press. I'm not naive to the fact that there is work involved and labor, and there is a cost to it, but we have not yet figured out a sustainable, equitable business model for financing the work of publishing if publishers are not going to be extracting rent for content. And that, to me, they're still extracting rent for content, though. I mean, they're still holding on to that model for, I don't know how much longer, but they're trying. Trust me. Trust me. I sit across the negotiation table from them. They're still trying to extract rent. We have not figured out a new model that, maybe is journals as a service. It's what the MIT framework is trying to advance, but that's a real intractable. It's not intractable. That is a real challenge. Is how do you pay for the labor and the work involved in openly sharing and publishing research outputs if you're not going to pay rent for the output itself?
So just to add to this, I think these are all important comments. There is a certain amount of proprietary instinct for many faculty. I'd say not necessarily everyone, but people become faculty in great part because they like the independence that comes with that position. It's different than working for a company where somebody's maybe directing your work at some level, even at the most flexible companies. And with that independence may come the idea that I'm just going to do things on my own. I don't have to bother with anybody. I don't have to bother with collaborators. I don't have to bother with a whole lot of bureaucracy. They may feel it's bureaucratic in the university, but it really isn't in general. So this proprietary instinct is very hard to overcome. And then there are also monetary incentives, direct monetary incentives that are proprietary that may come through forming companies or monetizing research and so forth. And so there is tension there at the individual level, which translates into a culture. Another obstacle is the promotion from assistant to associate in particular, more so than from associate to full. And the reason is when someone comes up for that promotion step, people don't really know for sure what is the impact of the research. There isn't really the test of time. we can look at things like citations, but citations become more meaningful when somebody has been around a while than when they're going from assistant to associate. So what do promotion committees fall back on is, well, you publish in a journal that's hard to get published in, where it has a very high standard for being published, or a very small percentage get accepted. And so that's a very imperfect standard for understanding impact. And frankly, we don't always understand impact when someone goes from associate to assistant to associate. So I think that's a challenge to overcome. And the last thing I'll say, and it relates to how do we pay for publications. Universities struggle a lot with their financial models and how to make universities balance their budgets. And effectively, there are lots of cross subsidies that exist in universities. One thing makes a profit and another thing loses money. And you have to move money around to make the university work. It's extraordinarily prevalent in academic health centers. The academic health centers pay for research because they make profits off of healthcare. And the patients and the insurers are paying for the research that occurs in the university. And to some degree in private universities, tuition profits pay for research as well. And so, that's what happens inside universities. And so how do we pay for publications, and where does the money come from? It's very complicated. And the last thing I'll say, what's going to drive change is, I believe it's very important that universities consider the competition that comes from private sector in innovation and prestige. And so it's not just us as a university faculty member looking for prestige, is how does a university gain prestige relative to a Google or an Amazon, where a lot of innovation occurs, and education occurs too, that they're building education programs and they're building clinical programs, and they're getting into a lot of the space of universities. And if universities kind of don't wake up, if they're not more innovative, in some ways they're not losing prestige relative to each other. It may be to the private sector.
I think this might be the last comment. Again, I mentioned that kind of universities can be quite conservative. They're amazing bureaucracies. It's very easy to make a barrier in a university. Yeah, it's much harder actually to remove it and overcome it, in my experience. The two groups of people I struggled with most at the Open University in changing our culture were heads of school and PhD supervisors. Yeah. They were the really tricky ones, yeah, because they both thought they knew what academic work should be like. So one of the things I did to try and overcome that was become a head of school. Yeah, and I did that for 3 years, and I didn't radically change what we did, but I did change it a bit. Do you know what I mean? And it was particularly in that area of open engaged work. And probably the most obvious impact I can demonstrate of that is how we changed the way we wrote our PhD projects. Yeah, they are different from what they were when I started being head of school. They're much more open and much more engaged. And the work that those PhD students are doing now will set them up from their academic careers. So, I do a lot of support for PhD students. And the first thing I always say to them is, what kind of academic do you really want to be? And that really is the most obvious change, I think, long-term change in terms of open work.
Well, I think we got the note that we're out of time. So thank you to Kathleen, Chris, Randy, and Richard. And we'll talk to you during the sessions. Thank you.